Dress circle as well in this auditorium. It's really a theater style. Well, good morning, everybody. Apologies for the slight, just a few minutes delay. Mr. Ramesh, Abhishek, Secretary, Department of Industrial Policy and Promotion, Ministry of Commerce and Industry. My old friend Sebastian, Lead Economist, Trade and Competitiveness Group, World Bank. Authors of the report, Mary Hallward-Driemeier, Senior Economic Advisor, World Bank. Gaurav, Nayyar, Senior Economist, World Bank Group. Distinguished panelists who you will hear from later. And ladies and gentlemen, very warm welcome to this book release titled Trouble in the Making, The Future of Manufacturing-Led Development, authored by Mary and Gaurav. And we are especially delighted to collaborate with the World Bank yet again, the release of what I think and what we think in ICRIER is an extremely timely and important work. It's timely because countries in emerging markets, including in India, and I think India in particular, as we reflect on our capabilities in competitiveness manufacturing, it becomes even more relevant because we have, I think, a severe employment problem. The Niti Aayog recently stated that unemployment is not too much of a problem in India. I mean, the point being that, in India, you can't afford to be unemployed. But really, the most serious problem is the underemployment problem. And as we look into the future, and this book reflects on where will the jobs come from, what impact will robotics, technology, et cetera, artificial intelligence, industrial automation, 3D printing, all of this have on job creation. Not to mention that the environment that we live in today is becoming increasingly protectionist, and therefore the labor-intensive, tradable sort of manufacturing growth that Korea and China and Japan saw before us, is that going to be realized? And there are examples that you will see in the book, and the authors will definitely talk about it, that companies influenced by the prospect of lower wages had moved manufacturing to locations where wages were lower, and now some amount of reshoring is beginning to happen as the lower cost or lower labor cost advantages tend to get offset by industrialization and robotics. And for example, factories in China, as the book reflects on, are projected to have more than 400,000, that's 4 lakh industrial robots installed by 2018, the highest number in any country of the world. Foxconn, the firm that is going to be investing in India as well, in Maharashtra and Andhra Pradesh, the firm known for producing Apple and Samsung products in China, has recently replaced 60,000 Chinese factory workers with industrial robots. And there are other examples from the Netherlands, Philips and Adidas in Germany that have reshored manufacturing facilities closer to their customers at home. The book also talks about high-income countries still account for a lion's share of manufacturing, especially value-added. But the share in workers is more in emerging markets like China. So China has a greater share of manufacturing employment than it has in value-added. And there is, of course, productivity differentials between emerging markets and developed countries. But there are, not to say everything is dismal, and I think the authors will talk about, they focus on the 3 C's, which I think are extremely important for India. Those 3 C's are competitiveness, capabilities, and connectedness. So, of course, the competitiveness we've seen in India, the ease of doing business, rankings have improved. We've moved up the scale on the World Competitiveness Index. So things are looking better in the competitiveness sphere for India compared to the past. Capabilities, which reflects on the skills, stronger firms and infrastructure, and of course connectedness, which is logistics, trade facilitation, and tariff restrictions. I remember a World Bank report which had spoken of comparing tariff reductions with improvements in logistics. And if you do a like-for-like comparison, a 10% reduction in tariffs will not give you as much of a bang for a buck as a 10%, however you measure it, improvement in let's say, connectedness or logistics. And so connectedness is important, and it gives you a better bang for buck compared to tariff reductions. In any case, tariffs now are seemingly lesser important than other sorts of non-tariff barriers. The question on everybody's mind, and I think Mary and Gaurav will talk about that, and Secretary will also talk about the views that we have in India, is that how important is automation, how challenging is automation going to be in the Indian context? And the book does talk about this, in which is that it's not going to be as important or as significant in developing markets like India as it is in other countries, because we do have still enjoy a labor cost advantage. And maybe that will still rule for a few more years, but it is a challenge. And the risk for countries like India is, of course, as I said, and that we are all grappling with, including academics, scholars, think tanks, and of course, chiefly policymakers. Where are the jobs going to be coming from? Is technology going to increase the jobs in the future, in the medium to long run? How long is that medium term going to be, and where the jobs are going to come from? So I think this is an existential challenge for India. It's a terribly important, and we at ICRIER have been doing a lot of work on labor markets and jobs, and I think it's a critical area of research for it's a critical area for research in ICRIER. And I'll just conclude by saying that last year's economic survey had actually talked about this in some detail and looked at the role of industrial policy, especially in labor-intensive manufacturing and commodity-intensive manufacturing in India, and focused on industries like sectors like textiles and footwear, where the bang for the buck in terms of every lakh rupee of investment in terms of jobs created is less. So wherever the labor employment elasticities are higher, a focus on those sectors to be able to create those productive jobs. As I said, in India, the focus has to be on creating productive jobs because people in India cannot afford to be unemployed because of poverty reasons, and therefore most of the employment is informal, it's not very productive, and so on, 90% of it. So the focus, a role for industrial policy, a role for investing in labor-intensive manufacturers, and of course, to make them more competitive, because we know that no country has become an industrial powerhouse or a manufacturing powerhouse just by relying on the domestic market. Domestic market is important, but it's equally important to be competitive. Without taking too much more of your time, let me once again say that ICRIER is absolutely delighted to partner with the World Bank in the release of this important report, and I thank Sebastian again and the Secretary for coming, and of course the authors who would you be hearing from, and thank you all for coming, and I hope all of you have a very productive and engaging seminar. Thank you very much.
Good morning, Honorable Ramesh, Abhishek, the IPP Secretary. Thank you so much for coming today and joining us in this dissemination activity. Rajat, thanks so much again for agreeing in partnering with us in the dissemination of this book. And on behalf of the country director of the World Bank in India, I would like to welcome you all and thank you for coming to today to participate in this dissemination activity. I think that this book is an extremely interesting book. The book analyzes, as was described briefly by Rajat, how new technologies are affecting manufacturing development patterns, as well as what are the challenges in terms of jobs for the future. I think that this book is of great and particular interest for India because of India's aspiration in terms of developing the manufacturing industries, as well as the Make in India strategy. We are very fortunate to have the two authors of this report, Mary and Gaurav. And if you look at the report, which is available online for download, and there are copies as well if you are interested in, and at the end you can have copies of the report. If you look at the acknowledgement section of the report, just by looking at the acknowledgement section, you will notice how comprehensive and how detailed the book is, because it brings opinions and contributions from a number of high qualified academics and experts, and this, I think, brings a lot of value to the book. I would also say that, unlike other publications, this book has, I would say, a very cautious optimism about what is going on and identify clearly what are the opportunities available for developing countries. So without further ado, I thank you again for coming and joining us today, and I think I will ask the authors to make their presentation. Thank you so much.
Great, thank you very much. And very much appreciate co-hosting with ICRIER. That's very much appreciated. And Honorable Secretary, we look forward to your comments as well as those of our distinguished panelists. So it is a real pleasure to be here. When we set out to do this project, as my colleague said, we have had a chance to talk to a lot of people from a range of different countries with a range of different sort of opinions about this topic and the approach. And I'll just say one of the key things in the title is the question mark. And so part of that is because this is a forward-looking piece. A lot of times we look backwards at the data and analyze to understand what happened. And we do try and do that in this book, but we're also trying very much in this to position the issues sort of going forward. And do think that the question mark is actually very relevant. Certainly in the popular media, you can get some very alarmist statistics, which ends up sort of promoting a sense of fear rather than sort of informed evidence to really look at what kinds of things may be needed to position countries, firms, workers to take advantage of opportunities that are coming in the future. So that was how we wanted to position it. We wanted to look at the evidence and trends to date and look for where some of the opportunities are. So to pay attention to what may be happening in terms of displacement, but that overall the impact is going to be shaped immensely by how well positioned people are to take advantages of opportunities going forward. So when we think about what's at stake in this agenda, we already see that there are shifts happening in manufacturing, and we anticipate that more shifts are going to be coming, and trying to understand some of what's driving those. And we see sort of two pieces of this being important. So one is what's happening in terms of the feasibility, in terms of how easy it may be, how it may be that the sort of bar is rising and it may become more challenging, either for countries to start industrializing or to continue on that path if they haven't gone that far, as well as those countries that have already succeeded in manufacturing, what it may take for them to maintain, let alone expand in that development path. And then particularly for lower income countries where traditionally the low wages and the low costs of production have been an important source of comparative advantage in attracting particularly foreign investors, but really trying to become an attractive location based on that. If this new technology really is labor saving, potentially radically so, such that wages are a less important component in the overall cost structure, what do countries need to do to be able to continue trying to attract that kind of investment? So that's the sort of overall plan of the issues that we're trying to address. So when we first sort of started, what is it about manufacturing? Why do we care about manufacturing per se? And so part of it is, as already described, it's been a really important driver of development. So most of the countries that have achieved high income status by current dates did so on the back of manufacturing and industrialization. Or there have been sort of particular circumstances about geography or natural endowments. But certainly there's been a fairly close association. But what was also mentioned is that how you achieve this matters. So there are countries that have tried to industrialize and increase their manufacturing behind closed borders, for which they may well have achieved something of an industrialization, but without quite the same sort of dynamic development benefits. So how you achieve the industrialization and expanded manufacturing matters. And in particular, those that have been able to do it in a more open fashion and a more export-led strategy have tended to have higher growth benefits and employment benefits. So when we look at sort of manufacturing more broadly, why has manufacturing had this sort of special role within development strategies, and see sort of two pieces that are particularly important. One is that it has been very successful at being able to absorb large numbers of largely unskilled workers. So there's sort of a pro-poor growth strategy in that, but also moving into an activity that's both higher level of productivity and one where the growth trajectory has also been positive. So it has had this sort of dual benefit of large numbers of jobs with a very sort of positive trend in productivity. So the question going forward is, if that productivity piece remains, what may happen on the employment dimension? So what we want to do this morning is look at three sort of different pieces in this overall story. First, look at some of the sort of stylized facts and trends about what's happening in manufacturing. Then second, look at some of the current trends in technology and globalization. And then third, look at what the overall impact would be in terms of some of the policy implications. So when we look at what is happening within manufacturing, looking first at sort of where manufacturing value added is happening, the first thing to note, the sort of really tall bars on the right, are for high-income countries. And these are high-income countries defined in 1994. And so in 1994, they would have accounted for over 3/4 of manufacturing value added globally. The trend has been downward. It is still, however, the case that they account for the majority of value added. The other big trend would be on the left-hand side, the rising bars, which is China. So China went from accounting for about 4% of global manufacturing value added in 94 to now being over 25%. And so China is the single largest manufacturing producer in the world these days. The other bars are World Bank acronyms for the different regions. So these are the developing countries in the different regions. So next to the high-income countries, we have South Asia, for which you can see an increase, but it's still at a fairly low level. So if you look globally, India has gone from just over 1% to 2.8%, so it has been expanding, but still at a fairly low level. When we look, however, not just at manufacturing value added, but at employment, the numbers are a little bit different. So the high-income countries, while being the majority of value added, account for about 15% of the jobs, whereas China accounts for over 40% of the global manufacturing jobs are in China. But many of the other developing regions have far sort of higher shares in employment than they do in manufacturing value added. So it's an important agenda item, certainly on employment in a much larger number of countries. But clearly, taking these two different points in mind, the labor productivity is quite different across countries. But if these are some of the trends of where manufacturing is happening across countries, wanted to look also at what's happening within countries. And there has been a lot of attention put by Professor Rajat at Harvard University on deindustrialization, and as he would say, premature deindustrialization, where the share of manufacturing within a country's GDP has been declining. And it's been declining both at lower levels of GDP per capita and at lower shares of GDP overall. So we wanted to look at this for a larger set of countries, and he is right in that on the horizontal axis, we're looking at the percentage change manufacturing represents now compared to 1994, and 3/4 of countries have a smaller share of their GDP in manufacturing today than they did in the mid-90s. India is actually just on the other side of the line. So it, if anything, has expanded, but not in a large extent. But the other thing to take note is on the horizontal axis is looking in terms of the absolute growth of the manufacturing sector. So this is saying, sort of taking out changes in price, how much larger in absolute terms is the manufacturing sector today than 20 years ago? And there, all but 12 countries, most of which have had sort of a significant conflict, or I guess Hong Kong's the one exception on that. But other than those 12 countries, the manufacturing sector is expanding in absolute terms. And so for India, it has expanded sort of considerably, sort of a fourfold increase. So what's happening is that manufacturing is expanding, but at a lower rate often than services. So while it is growing, services are growing faster, hence as a share of GDP it's declining. But I think keeping that in mind when we think about deindustrialization is actually really important, and looking therefore not just at manufacturing, but also service development when we look to see at where jobs are being created and what the story would be for productivity growth. Then the third sort of trend wanting to look at is within countries, what's happening across sectors within manufacturing. And here we've taken some country examples. It's not an absolute trend, but it is quite striking by income groups how they differ. So if you look at high-income countries, one thing to note is that they tend to produce across the board in manufacturing. And this sort of phenomenon of deindustrialization in terms of a decline in the share of GDP, you actually see that fairly consistently across the board across these different sectors. So if you look at some of the upper middle-income countries, some of which are actually industrializing too, you see different shift. That there's sort of a relative decline in some of the more labor-intensive, lower value-added sectors, things like garments and textiles or some of the regional commodity processing, and an expansion into some of the more capital-intensive or more innovative kinds of sectors. So this could be transportation equipment, electronics, and machinery. And so you sort of see that difference. And this is sort of following the sort of product cycle or flying geese kind of model. And one of the things that we're interested in looking, and it's worth following going forward, is how much that kind of trend is going to continue. Because as Gaurav will show you in just a minute, some of these trends of what's happening in the world are impacting differentially across some of these different sectors. When we look at some of the lower income countries, however, first is that many of them don't have the same sort of comparative advantage in manufacturing. And to the extent they do, it really does tend to be in those more labor-intensive, lower value-added sectors, so the things like garments and textiles or different commodity processing. So I am going to turn over to Gaurav to talk about some of these trends.
Thank you, Mary. So with that, talking about the past, I hope in the next set of slides we can give you a little bit of a glimpse into the future. So typically, what we have seen in history is changes at the intersection of technology and globalization have been associated with shifts in the global manufacturing landscape. And Mary showed to you the dramatic rise of China as a manufacturing powerhouse starting in the mid-1990s. And that has coincided essentially with the ICT revolution and falling transport costs, which enabled the global fragmentation of production, which China managed to take advantage of. The question now is, going forward, will newer technologies and further shifting patterns of globalization affect the evolution of the manufacturing landscape? In this book, we essentially look at three trends. The first trend is that of the advent and diffusion of new manufacturing process technologies, and we in particular look at three: robotics, 3D printing, and the Internet of Things or smart factories. These are process technologies which are important for developing countries because they can affect the way traditional manufactured goods are produced. So we're not really talking about advanced manufactured goods, but technologies which can affect the production of traditional goods. What we see, and as Rajat outlined in his opening remarks, is that a lot of high-income countries are rapidly automating. The data we have is that on the use of robots, and this is what you see in the chart. And China at the bottom of the chart on the left-hand side is clearly the big story here, where by next year, it's projected to have the largest stock of industrial robots in the world. What this means is that the great migration of unskilled labor jobs that was expected to take place from China to other lower income countries, including India and those in Africa, might never happen if this robotization can actually take away the advantage of having low labor costs to attract manufacturing production. Having said that, what you see on the right-hand side of the chart is that this automation or robotization is not uniform across manufacturing sectors. There are some manufacturing sectors or industries that have seen a much greater use of robots. And the two that stand out in the orange and the blue are transportation equipment, so your motor vehicles, autos, and the more sort of electronics, computing machinery, etc. So these are the two sectors that stand out in terms of the use of robots. The book does not only talk about technology. We also talk about how trade patterns themselves might be changing irrespective of changes in technology. So what you see on the left-hand side is the general slowdown in trade in recent years. And of course, this in part is linked to the financial crisis, where you see the downward spike in 2008, and then a recovery after that, following the crisis. But still, that recovery has not reached pre-crisis levels in terms of trade growth. So there is a trade slowdown. And if you see the gray line, that is the one that talks about the import content of manufacturing exports. So that's kind of a measure of how global value chains are progressing and doing. And what you see there in that gray line is that there was a decline which happened a little bit before the financial crisis in 2008. So just to say that this slowing down of trade is, of course, a cyclical phenomenon, but not only. And there is a structural component to it, too. And that's what you see on the right-hand side of the chart. If you put your eyes on the top, on the left, sort of the computers and the transportation equipment. Now, these are sectors which you typically associate with global value chains. These are the sectors which experienced the highest rates of growth during the 1990s, which you see on the vertical axis. But what you see on the horizontal axis, which measures the growth over the last decade and a half, you see that these very industries have actually experienced relatively low or much slower rates of trade growth than in the past. So there has been trade which is slowing, and many of that has happened with the so-called maturing of some of these global value chains. The third trend, and the final trend we look at in the book, is the servicification of manufacturing. So the famous smile curve, which all of you are familiar with, seems to have become less flat over time. And that is to say that services are increasingly taking up a larger share of the total value added in a given product's value chain. So it's not only the production per se, but the services that increasingly account for a large value of production, and they also matter for the competitiveness of your manufacturing sector. And these are not only the traditional services, such as distribution services or transport services, but increasingly, business services will play an increasingly important role in determining how competitive your manufacturing is, especially if you move to some of these newer technologies. Think of data and how this data can be produced and used to optimize production processes. This highlights the importance of services. So cloud computing, for example, can increase the efficiency in data management and data storage. And on the other side, big data analytics can help firms actually use this data to become more efficient. So this is the third trend that we look at in the book. What does this all mean for how the bar might be rising for countries looking to industrialize? So what you see, once again, is that there's heterogeneity across the manufacturing sector. Now, I'll just explain this graph very quickly. On the vertical axis, you have a measure of automation. So that's the robots per 1,000 employees. On the horizontal axis, you have a measure of trade concentration in that given product or sector. So essentially, whether the top 10 countries account for a very large share of total trade in that product. The colors of the bubbles tell you how traded these sectors are internationally. So what you see on the right-hand side, all those orange bubbles are the ones that are traded a lot internationally, and those, once again, are your transportation equipment, computer electronics, pharmaceuticals, textiles, apparel. And on the left-hand side, all the green is the sort of low-traded. As it happens, it's the sectors that are highly traded are also typically the sectors that are more concentrated in terms of trade. So once again, it is these transportation equipment, electronics, textile apparel, which are more concentrated than the others. And the size of the bubble tells you the use of professional services as an input into these different manufacturing sectors. And therefore, what you see on the top right-hand side is sectors which are experiencing all of these three trends. So if you look at transportation or if you look at electronics, there's a high use of professional services in these sectors. They're highly traded and highly concentrated in terms of trade, and they're also experiencing, to the maximum degree, these new automation technologies. So these manufacturing sectors are likely the sectors where the bar is going to be rising the most for countries looking either to get in or to expand. Textiles is an apparel and leather products. That is a bit of a unique sector because at the moment, there is next to no automation in that sector. So the recent FT article talked about the sewbot, so a robot that can sew. But luckily for countries like India and many other developing countries, that technology is not yet even technologically feasible. So there will come a time when it will become technologically feasible. But then after that, there will also be some more time before that technology can actually become economically or commercially viable. So there is that sector in the bottom right-hand corner. It's highly concentrated in terms of trade, and that's really a China phenomenon, because China basically constitutes a large majority, a large share of world exports in this sector. But that is beginning to change a little bit as you see other countries coming up. So that sort of concentration is not necessarily a reflection of what will happen in the future. And on the left-hand side of the chart, you have the more commodity-based manufacturers, which are less traded, less concentrated in terms of trade. Some of them are relatively more automated, so rubber and plastics and fabricated metals, for example, but many others are not. So wood products, paper products, basic metals, food processing, these are commodity-based manufacturing sectors which are not experiencing some of these forward-looking trends. And therefore, like textiles and apparel, some of these commodity-based sectors are also sectors where the bar might be rising less. So to sort of not answer, but to allude to Rajat's question at the beginning is where are the jobs going to come from? If some of these forward-looking trends are to be believed, it's some of these kinds of manufacturing industries, so commodity-based and the labor-intensive apparel and leather, where the bar is perhaps not rising as much. Now, these three trends tell you about how the feasibility of manufacturing might be changing for countries. There is also another sort of part to the puzzle, which is, do these trends mean that manufacturing may not be as uniquely desirable as it was in the past? Now, manufacturing, as Mary said at the beginning, was considered a good thing because it created jobs for unskilled workers, and then helped to raise their productivity over time due to technology diffusion and other such features. Now, what's going to happen to jobs and how many jobs are at risk of getting automated? You would have seen several estimates. There are many studies out there which do this kind of analysis. Some studies say 50% of jobs are at risk of automation. Some even say 80% of jobs are at risk of automation. But there were some problems in those estimates, and newer techniques have been able to recalibrate those estimates to an extent. And these new studies look at tasks rather than occupations. So it's not as if automation can automate away an entire occupation, but it's likely to automate away certain tasks in an occupation. And therefore, when you see these results, you can see that jobs at risk of automation are much lower than what has been predicted before. So about 10 to 12% in many higher income countries, and even much lower in developing countries that you see on the top, like Laos and Vietnam. But even these estimates need to be taken with a pinch of salt, because what they don't show is the number of jobs that will never get created. So a country like India may not have so many jobs in manufacturing, for example, currently, that will get automated away, but the greater danger is that some jobs that would have been created had the status quo been the same in terms of not having these new technologies, those might never get created. On the positive side, these estimates also don't show that many newer jobs or newer occupations can also be created, as has happened through history before, as new technologies come about. But that's just a question on whether manufacturing will remain as uniquely desirable as before in terms of the jobs. And then also, there is a question of if manufacturing becomes less traded, for example. A lot of the benefits of manufacturing came from the fact that it was traded internationally. That might change. Just think of 3D printing as one example. What does it do? It essentially is going to substitute trade in services for trade in goods. So instead of goods being moved around across countries, you will have a designer based in the US, for example, who will send across a design to a 3D printing facility based in India. So what it's going to do is it might reduce trade in goods and substitute trade in services for that. And to the extent that that happens, once again, that unique desirability of manufacturing may fall. So I've told you that there might be some trouble in the making. I'll leave Mary to go through the tougher last part on what countries can do to prepare.
All right, so this is this last section in terms of what some of the policy ideas would be and a framework on how to think about it. So we have come up with a three-part framework that we've called the 3 Cs. So we want to look at competitiveness, capabilities, and connectedness. So a couple of things to note. On the one hand, these are not new ideas. So even if technology is new and some of the challenges associated with technology is new, it does not mean that all of the policy issues that we've been debating for decades are suddenly irrelevant. In fact, what we would say is that certain pieces of the traditional development set of policy issues, if anything, are more urgent than before, particularly if wages are no longer going to be the same, playing the same sort of role in defining comparative advantage. The broader set of the business environment and competitiveness will probably be all the more important. At the same time, there are some elements in each of these 3 pillars that would be new and introduced because of technology. So I want to sort of take a little bit on both of those. So in terms of competitiveness, so one of the key sort of areas would be the broader business environment or regulatory environment and framework, but also the supporting infrastructure, the kinds of institutions that can support private sector development and facilitate adjustment across different kinds of activities. In terms of some elements that are a little bit more new, one of the things that technology is introducing are new forms of business models, right? Everything from the sort of Uber, Airbnb, but a lot of sort of gig economy and short-term contracting that opens up new sets of opportunities. There can be, therefore, different kinds of contracting, different forms of payment. But also, there can be other kinds of sort of platforms and network ways of producing that change and introduce some new potential challenges on the competition front, particularly where there are these sort of network effects and sort of significant first-mover advantage. It does introduce new ways of trying to think about what an appropriate regulatory framework might be for these new ways of doing business. And last, putting mobile finance, which again isn't quite new, but the extent to which it is likely to be a key driver of a whole set of different kinds of interactions, the delivery not just of manufactured goods, but a lot of the services that are embedded in them, that will be a big part of their value added, is going to be really sort of critical going forward. Within the capabilities agenda, sort of first order, this is skills. And I think this is where a lot of countries have put a lot of emphasis when they think about technology and how to ensure more workers have opportunities is really looking at their skills agenda and would agree that that's very important. I think sort of a corollary to that hasn't had as much attention is a particular set of skills, namely for managers. And so this is something the business school literature is very familiar with. The economists have been paying less attention to until recently. But there's work coming out originally from the LSE and now Stanford and MIT on the world management surveys that have tried to sort of quantify and be able to compare how firms and managers do. And what's particularly interesting is the whole sort of phenomenon of setting goals and being able to monitor how well your firm is meeting them and adjusting. This whole data revolution and these smart factories put that much more emphasis on the ability for data and sensors and real-time feedback loops to be able to improve it. But that's precisely an area where many, many managers don't perform very well. So in terms of taking advantage of the efficiency gains that this sort of digital revolution promises, there's some real work that needs to be done within firms such that they can take advantage and absorb and use these new technologies. The nature of the skills that are needed is also something that needs to be sort of looked at. So first order, often there's attention on STEM, so the engineering and science skills to be able to contribute directly to new technology. And I think that absolutely can be important, but that's not the only kind of skill that's going to be needed, right? So there's a lot of other kinds of skills, including ones that it's harder for technology to be able to replace, would be human creativity and even interpersonal skills. So that we hope the robots cannot replace to quite the same extent. But if you sort of look at where some of the new jobs are being created, it's precisely in some of those areas. So the STEM kind of skills is important, but that's not the only set of things to be looking at. And the other sort of broad dimension on capabilities is that broader, and this is sort of a cross between sort of the competitiveness and capability, sort of an ecosystem to support this adoption of technology. And in particular, the sort of data ecosystem that's really critical with a lot of these digitally based technologies. So this can be issues around privacy and security and sort of trade and ownership in data. And if you talk to a lot of the private sector, this is often first order when they're looking where to invest and what kind of technology to use. And then lastly, on connectedness, this is the sort of trade in goods agenda, the logistics to support it, to be able to move the goods around. But the other sort of pieces in this that need more attention, which is not a new agenda, has politically been far more sensitive, but as Gaurav was showing, is going to be an increasingly important part of being successful in manufacturing, as well as in services as its own right, is helping open up to sort of more competition and access to services, both on the pre-production and especially on the post-production, the embedded services in goods. And then sort of lastly, that sort of data ecosystem having an international dimension too on the tradedness in data. So we then wanted to look and see how countries stack up on these 3 Cs. So we've got connectedness on the horizontal, capabilities on the vertical, and colors in terms of competitiveness. So India is circled there. So India has been in the headlines a lot in terms of the progress that's been made in some of the competitiveness, particularly the regulatory framework and the sort of significant increase in the Doing Business Index in particular. In terms of both the capabilities and the connectedness, however, there's still room for improvement. I mean, we will note on any of these large countries, these are sort of averages, and there's clearly pockets of excellence, particularly in capabilities within India. But as an overall, when you look at what some of the reform priorities would be, this gives some indication. The other would be sort of looking at this compared to the kinds of goods that India already has a comparative advantage in and the kinds of sectors that it is trying to move into that much more. So competing in the old existing technology is one thing. Looking forward on terms of being able to absorb and compete using new technology, things like the capabilities agenda is going to be important. And increasingly, some of that connectedness, and for India, the trade and services would be another piece to really be looking at. So when we sort of think about these sort of set of issues, and I'm sure we'll hear more from the India specific from our panelists, this sort of trading off between the window still being feasible on existing technology, so there's still scope for expansion there, but looking forward to how to sort of move up into some of these other ones I think will be important. There's questions around industrial policy. With things that are moving quickly, that's worth taking things into account. And recognizing that in a sort of a broader ecosystem, there can be particular dangers of taking too isolated an approach on trying to very specifically promote particular sectors if the complementary pieces may not be there. At the same time, when you're looking at the various kinds of policy reforms that you may be making sure that they add up with a particular sector lens is going to be important. So to really sort of unleash those constraints, you need to sort of look and make sure that the sort of whole set that may be needed in a particular sector are being looked after. And recognizing, as Gaurav showed, that the range of changes are different across different sectors, looking at some of this from a sector lens can be important. And I am going to, I think, at this point, hold off on any of the others for broader discussion. But I think just sort of as key takeaway, remember we started with that question mark in the title. So I think we sort of reassured ourselves that the real sort of alarmism is not the appropriate approach, that there is urgency, change is already happening. And even if a lot of the technology may not yet be widespread within India, it is happening in other countries, and so the pressures on being able to up the game to sort of stay competitive is real, but that there's still a lot of opportunities through a range of different sort of subsectors for this to remain an important development strategy. And I will end there. Thank you.
Thank you, Mary, and thank you, Gaurav, for that introduction to the report. Before the panel discussion, it's my privilege and honor on behalf of both institutions, the World Bank and ICRIER, to invite Mr. Ramesh Abhishek, the Secretary, DIPP, to give his keynote address. His CV is in the folder with you, but let me read out a few key things that I think are relevant to what we are discussing. He is a member of the IAS 1982 batch, Bihar Cadre, and he holds a master's degree in public administration from Harvard Kennedy School. He also has a master's degree in business administration and finance, as well as a master's degree in international relations. He's also worked in the Supreme Court of India as a key member of the e-governance committee that is entrusted with the task of bringing e-governance into the judiciary. Since March 2016, he's been the secretary of DIPP, which is the Department of Industrial Policy and Promotion, the key department which is spearheading key government initiatives such as Make in India, Startup India, Ease of Doing Business, Intellectual Property Rights, and Industrial Corridors in the country. During his term, as you just heard, India has seen a remarkable jump of 30 rankings in the World Bank Doing Business Report 2018. Several FDI reforms have also been done, and record FDI inflow of $60 billion recorded in 2016-17. Administration of intellectual property have also seen a dramatic turnaround during his term. As chairman of Invest India as well, and those most of you will know about this new Invest India, really a dynamic institution which I've had the privilege to visit. He has guided the investment promotion agency into facilitating over $85 billion worth of foreign investment proposals in 2 years, out of which 7.5 billion have already been realized. So it's really a privilege to hear from the Secretary what we are doing in this area. Thank you very much, Mr. Abhishek.
Very good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Let me first congratulate Mary and Gaurav on this brilliant report, and I also like to thank the bank and ICRIER for inviting me in this very august audience. I am also looking forward to the panel discussion with such experts. Just like to share some thoughts with you. It's not much of a keynote address. I wish I knew as much to give a keynote address. I think this report is also very timely because we are in the middle of rewriting our industrial policy, and we have been working on this since July, and we find that this scenario is becoming very complex, and we really need to have clarity on what policies we should have. And this report will definitely help us in this area to get more clarity. We have, of course, traditional industries, labor-intensive industries, which luckily will not get so affected by the smart technologies. As was pointed out, one of the saving grace is that we will not lose too many jobs that we never created. I think that's a that's a big help. And in the labor-intensive industries, which provide most of the jobs, and the medium and small sector and the informal sector, the smart technologies don't touch it as directly, perhaps. But we are also very clear that we have challenges, plus, but we have more opportunities than challenges. On this, from the government, different branches of Government of India are very clear on that. We are very clear that we need to embrace the new technologies. We need to make public policies. We need to support infrastructure, skill development, and whatever we need to do to ensure that the new technologies are adopted in India in a seamless manner. At what speed, which sector will, which industry will adopt this is something that we have to see, is going to differ. Reskilling will be a big challenge. But I think on this importance of artificial intelligence, importance of Internet of Things, importance of other smart manufacturing technologies like robotics and additive printing, I think we are very clear that these are great opportunities for us. Ultimately, one has to be competitive. It's not a choice that we have. We have to make ourselves competitive, whether in goods or services. If we want, world is becoming more competitive. So we don't have a choice of adopting or not adopting some technologies. I'd like to focus on the recommendations which have come, which are very interesting. For example, the old agenda there's a very interesting mix in competitiveness, business environment. Our business environment, we realize for the last 4 years, 3.5 years of this government, needs a dramatic improvement, or needed a dramatic improvement, and it's improving. The World Bank rank jump is only one indicator of the enormous work being done, not only by central government, but more importantly by the state governments. The ranking that we started of states in 2015 has set off a fierce competition, and fierce I'm using very deliberately, among states to improve their business environment, and they are really working very hard. I think this is something that needs to continue till we make doing business in India very, very simple and easy, with no personal interface, with totally technology-driven governance, smart risk management systems, and so on. And this work will go on, and with greater speed. Now that this rank jump has happened, as a matter of fact, the bureaucracy and the political leadership has got even more charged that, yes, we can achieve it. So this has been a big help, actually. Infrastructure has been a big challenge in India. We all know that. And I think this investment that are being made in infrastructure, and I'm sure at PPP also will come back in many of the infrastructure sectors more effectively. And this is really most important. And we can't possibly have the smooth functioning of the smart technologies without a good infrastructure. Power has to be we need to have uninterrupted quality power, and we need to have a really good infrastructure. There's no question about it, and I think we need to do a lot of work on this. On the additional elements of competitiveness, new business models, we are very clear, and our support to startups from the central government and state governments. We have a specific policy of supporting the new business models, sharing technologies, and all the disruptive business models, whether they are, I can just name a few, e-pharmacies, peer-to-peer lending platforms, and so on. There's so many of them. And we want state governments on board because many of these regulations are made by the state governments. So our involving the states in startups, one of the key outcomes that we want, that states should make regulations which are easier and which suit these new disruptive business models. So I think this is extremely important to have complete regulatory and government support for new business models, and we are doing that. And definitely, we have some major advantages, as we all know, because of the India stack that we have. This entire digital identities, the mobile phones, and this new adoption of technology in providing services everywhere, I think really gives us an edge, which not many countries may have. And we are going to leverage this. And we need in our industrial policy, we'd like to have a very clear policy and roadmap of how we are going to leverage our help, support or our advantage of this digital infrastructure. Of course, we have so much to do in extending the digital infrastructure. We still have only about 400 million odd people with internet access. We are rapidly increasing it, and I think a lot of work needs to be done. Digital skills, digital literacy is another major challenge that we have to tackle with as we go forward. Skill development, reskilling, I think is one of the biggest challenges. This is an area which has been neglected in India by and large. Scale has been very, very poor, and the quality also has been less than acceptable in most cases. In last 3 years, Skill India program has tried to scale up. Sector skill councils are there, but I think a lot of work needs to be done, particularly in the areas of smart technologies. And Ministry of Skill Development, and we are all working together to see how we can have an effective program of skill development and reskilling for Industry 4.0 technologies. I think capacity developments are very, very critical. I think logistics infrastructure, trade in goods, we have a great advantage in services, as we know. And as more and more manufacturing has embedded service components, I think that's a great advantage for us. Nowadays, a lot of consumers don't want the goods, they want the services. And I think we have a very, outside this manufacturing itself, there are many areas, like as has been identified in the report, that services, providing services, processing of commodities, there we really have an edge and advantage, which we need to leverage. So there are a lot of challenges, but there are a lot of opportunities. And with government going all out now to identify policies, make policies, give support, we are also on a learning curve. We want to know what more needs to be done, what needs to be done. That's why this report, this discussion today, and our deliberations, present and future, with experts on the subject and industry is going to be very helpful, because we also need to understand what are the implications for India. It's a complex scenario. We all know that it's not easy, but I think a lot can be done by leveraging the knowledge and expertise that we have in academia, in industry, and in various knowledge bodies like bank and ICRIER. So we look forward to the panel discussion. Thank you, and congratulations on the report. And we really look forward to your feedback, your suggestions to the government today, in future, so that we make a policy, we make a plan which is the best for our country, give our people jobs and the livelihood and the quality of life that they deserve. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen.
Thank you, Mr. Abhishek. May I request you to now please launch the report in India? May I request the panelists, so we'll just reorganize the dais and request the panelists to come over for the panel discussion. Thank you all very much.